Welcome to Evaluation of Information and Ethical and Legal Use of Information. In this final module, we will address two interconnected areas. First, how to critically evaluate the information and sources you have collected, and second, how to use that information in an ethical and legally compliant manner. As researchers, it's our responsibility not only gather and organize knowledge as covered in modules 1 and 2, but also to ensure that the knowledge we build upon is relevant and that we contribute back to the scholarly community with integrity. Once you have a collection of articles, books, and other materials, you need to critically evaluate its sources' quality, relevance, and credibility. Not all information is created equal. Even within scholarly literature, you will encounter varying levels of rigor and potential bias. And if you include non-scholarly sources like industry reports, news articles, or websites, the variance is even greater. So, how do you determine if a source is trustworthy and useful for your research? Here are some criteria and questions to consider which are commonly recommended in information literacy training: authority, accuracy, and evidence, purpose and bias, relevance, currency, and publisher or peer review status. Authority. Who is the author or creator of the information, and what are their credentials? Are they an expert in the field? Also, what is the source of publication? Is it a reputable academic journal, a university press book, a government or NGO report, or a self-published blog? Generally, peer-reviewed academic sources carry more weight in research because they have passed through a quality control process. Check the author affiliations and other work. For a website or report, check the organization behind it. Accuracy and evidence. Does the source provide evidence for its claims? In a research article, is the methodology sound and are the data and results present clearly? Are there citations and references that you could verify? Reliable sources will allow you to trace claims back to data or established literature. Be wary of writing that makes big claims without backing them up, or articles that seem to cherry pick data supporting a preconceived conclusion. Purpose and bias. Why was this information created? Consider whether the sources has an obvious bias or agenda. For example, an opinion piece or an advocacy group's report may have a particular slant. That doesn't mean that you can use them, but you should account for the perspective and not treat them as neutral evidence. Academic research articles can also have biases, for instance, in study design or interpretation, so think critically about potential blind spots or conflict of interest, like who funded the research. Relevance. Is the content of the source directly relevant to your research question? Does it meaningfully contribute to answering your questions or providing context? Sometimes an article might be high quality, but only tangentially related to your specific topic. Prioritize sources that address your research needs. Currency. Especially in fast-moving fields like technology or health sciences, the date of publication matters. Check when the information was published or last updated. In some fields, a 5-year-old paper might be outdated if a lot of newer research has emerged. However, in other fields or in foundational theory, older sources might still be highly valuable. The key is to ensure you're aware of the most recent developments in your area, so your literature review remains up to date. Use newer resources to complement classics. Publisher or peer review status. Was the article peer reviewed? Most scholarly journals are. You can often infer by the journal's reputation or explicitly checking the journal information. If it's a book, it is from an academic publisher or a known authority. If it's a website, does it have an editorial process? Knowing the vetting process behind information can help gauge reliability. By systematically evaluating your sources on this criteria, you will end up with a set of literature that you trust and that is worthy of being included in your PhD research. This critical evaluation step is crucial for maintaining high standards in your work. It's far better to have a slightly smaller list of well-vetted sources than a huge list including some questionable ones that could undermine your analysis. Additionally, be alert to predatory journals or conferences. These are outlets that claim to be scholarly but do not actually implement your proper peer review and seek primarily to collect fees from authors. If you come across an article in an unfamiliar journal, especially open access ones, it's wise to verify that the journal is legitimate. For example, check if it's indexed in known databases or consult lists from the library. Using only reputable sources protects you from basing your research on flawed or dubious studies. Ethical use of information. Now, once you have chosen high-quality sources, how do you use the information ethically and legally in your own work? This aspect breaks down into a few key areas: avoiding plagiarism, respecting copyright laws, and protecting confidential and proprietary information. Plagiarism is one of the most serious breaches of academic ethics. It involves using someone else's words, ideas, or data without proper acknowledgement. To avoid this, make sure that anytime you include ideas or quotes from a source, you provide an appropriate citation. Even if you paraphrase, put in your own words, the idea still originated from someone else, so you must cite the source. The only exception is for common knowledge, facts widely known and not attributable to a single source. But when in doubt, cite. Good note taking habits, as Nieves mentioned, can help here. Clearly mark in your notes when something is a direct quote or comes from a specific source, so you don't accidentally mix up your own thoughts with the strategic text. Many institutions have strict policies on plagiarism, and the consequence can be severe, ranging from failing on an assessment to expulsion or retention of published papers. Using a plagiarism detection tool on your thesis draft, many universities provide access to such software for students, can be a helpful way to double-check that you haven't unintentionally copied text without citation. Citation practices. Ethical use of information means giving credit where it's following the citation style prescribed by your department or field, APA, MLA, Chicago, IEEE, and apply it consistently. Ensure that every source you consult and that influence your work is included in your reference list, unless your guidelines say differently for things like personal communications. Also, cite primary sources whenever possible. For example, if you read about a study through a secondary source, try to find the original study and cite that to credit the original authors and to verify the context. Quotations and paraphrase. If you use the exact words from a source, put them in quotation marks or intended as a block quote if lengthy, and cite the source with a page number if applicable. Use direct quotes sparingly and only when the specific wording is important, as excessive quotation can make it seem like you are not synthesizing the information. More often, if you will paraphrase, restate the ideas in your own words, and then cite the source. A good paraphrase significantly rephrases the original text and integrates it into your argument, but even with a paraphrase, a citation is required. Quoting and paraphrasing properly is both an ethical practice and a skill that improves with the time and feedback. Using figures, tables, and data. If you want to reuse a figure or table from someone else's work in your thesis or publication, you usually need to get permission from the publisher or ensure it's under a license that allows reuse. Sometimes an image or graph might be available under a Creative Commons license. In such cases, follow the terms of that license, often requiring attribution and sometimes allowing only not commercial use. If you cannot get permission, an alternative is to redraw the figure or summarize the data in a new figure of your own, and then cite the source of the original data. Always give credit in the figure caption. For example, source, author, year. For data or the data sets that you incorporate, check the uses terms. Some may be public domain, others might require acknowledgement or have restrictions. Respecting copyright and licensing. Beyond just figures, any text or material you incorporate should respect copyright law. Academic work generally falls under fair use or similar exception for purposes or commentary, criticism, or education. But fair use has limits, especially if you were to publish your thesis as a book, for example. The safest route is to always attribute sources and not to reproduce large portions of any work that isn't yours. For software or tools that you use, abide their licenses. For example, if you adapt someone's open source code in your research, credit them and not the license. Confidential or proprietary data. In some research fields, you might handle confidential data or information, perhaps from a company collaboration or sensitive human subject data. Ethical use of information in these cases means adhering strictly to confidentiality agreements, anonymizing data if required, and following laws such as data protection regulations. While this might be less about literature and more about your research data, it's worth mentioning. Never disclose sensitive information in your publications or presentations unless it has been cleared for release and properly anonymized. Ethical research conduct requires protecting participants' privacy and respecting any intellectual property boundaries. Essentially, ethical and legal use of information boils down to using information honestly and responsibly. Give credit to others for their work. Do not misrepresent others' work as your own, and follow the rules regarding sharing and reproducing content. As an academic, your reputation and credibility are among your most valuable assets. And those are built by maintaining integrity in how you use information. As one educational rubric puts it, you should demonstrate correct and contextual use of citations and references, and a full understanding of the ethical and legal restriction on information use, such as copyright and confidentiality. Before we conclude this module, let's highlight a few key takeaways for evaluation and using information ethically. Always critically assess your sources for credibility, relevance, and quality. Use criteria like authority, evidence, bias, and timeliness to decide if a source earns a place in your research. Rely primarily on scholarly peer-reviewed sources for your core arguments. But if you use other types of sources, news, webs, etc., acknowledge their nature and cross-verify information when possible. Give credit to the originators of ideas through proper citation. When in doubt, cite. Better to be overly cautious than to inadvertently plagiarize. Paraphrase or quote correctly. Don't just copy paste in your notes or drafts without clearly marking it, and ensure all quotations are attributed. Aim to synthesize information in your own voice. Understand the rules of copyright and fair use for any third-party material you include, such as images or large data sets. Obtain permissions if necessary or use alternatives. Keep in mind your institutions and broader academic policies or research ethics. If you're ever unsure about something, for example, can I use this chapter I published in my thesis? Or how do I cite this dataset properly? Seek guidance from your advisor, your university guidelines, or a librarian. By diligently evaluating your sources and using them ethically, you not only uphold academic integrity, but also enhance the credibility of your own work. Readers, including your thesis examiners or peer reviews for a journal, will trust your research more if they see that you have built it on reliable sources and given appropriate credit through. This concludes Module 3 and the core content of our course. In next video, Alexis, Nieves, and I will share our final reflections to help you continue your research journey with confidence. Thank you for your attention.